Only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on the new pharmaceutical waste management rule that has recently been proposed by the EPA. My name's James and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before we dive into the content and introduce you to our speaker today, I'd like to give you a brief overview on what this webinar is going to entail, and we'll run through a few different housekeeping items for those of you that may not have attended one of our webinars in the past. So as you can see here, all lines will be muted, but you can communicate using the questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you have a question for our speaker at any time throughout the webinar, you can enter that, or if there's a technical issue, you can use that method as well. We'll address all of the questions at the end of the presentation during our Q&A period, and if we don't get to every question, just know that we will follow up directly following the webinar in the next couple of days. Also, as you can see at the bottom there, we will be sending you a copy of the slide deck and the webinar recording tomorrow, so all the materials will be in your inbox tomorrow. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Steve Tedisco. Steve is the Corporate Director of Healthcare for Triumvirate Environmental. Here is where he oversees Triumvirate's healthcare vertical market. Steve's been a Triumvirate leader since 2003, and through his 13 years of environmental experience, has become an industry expert in the management of highly complex, multidiscipline waste management programs within the healthcare industry. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Steve. Hey, Steve.
Hey, James. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. As James mentioned, my name is Steve Tedisco, and I have been living the pharmaceutical waste management role for quite a while here at Triumvirate. Looking forward to covering the proposed rule today and some of the updates associated with that. This is our agenda for today. We got a 6-point agenda. Do a little bit of a RCRA overview as it relates to pharmaceutical waste management, and on down the line we'll talk about current issues that are related specifically to healthcare, specific to pharmaceutical waste management. Go over the rule, go over the proposed rule, talk about all the major components of it, identify a little bit of an action plan, get you guys off to the races with a running start so that any modifications to an existing program that needs to be made can be done, and ultimately anybody who still has yet to build a program has an action plan for moving forward. And as James collects those questions throughout the course of the webinar, we'll do a Q&A session towards the end. What I'd like to do is really tell a story on how pharmaceutical waste management began. Back in the mid to late 90s, there was a series of water quality testing studies that had been done by the Associated Press, and ultimately 2003 really started to take root when it comes to pharmaceutical waste management. We saw the first programs really start to get created back then. And as analytics get better through those water quality testing studies, as we measure things in higher ranges like the parts per quadrillion range and so on, a lot of the items that they've been looking for, they have actually found in terms of pharmaceuticals in the water supply. Since then, Triumvirate's been fortunate enough to have built a couple hundred programs all across what amounts to over 20 states, 20 different states, and really how this will help will address the next chapter in pharmaceutical waste collection. So here is your ticket to help prep for any of those program modifications. Before we begin, James has a quick polling question.
And I've just launched that poll. So as you can see here, we're asking, how concerned are you about this proposed regulation? Very concerned, somewhat concerned, not concerned. We just want to gauge how you're feeling as this is rolled out. So we'll give you about 20 seconds or so to respond to that. Okay, looks like pretty much everyone responded. And at 53%, it looks like our audience is somewhat concerned about this, and 28% are very concerned about this regulation, and 19% not quite as much, Steve.
Great, thank you, James. It's good data for me as a speaker just to sort of gauge and build a conversation surrounding not only the update but how folks are interested in the ultimate parts of the program here. So as mentioned in the agenda, we're going to spend a moment on RCRA and how it came to be. The year was 1976, a long, long time ago. This year marks 40 years, and really a lot has changed. a lot has changed to the way we generate waste, the way we collect waste, and ultimately the way that some of these interpretations have moved and evolved. Of course, we all know that RCRA is what governs hazardous waste, and that hazardous pharmaceuticals fall into this category. There are a lot of folks out there, specifically in healthcare, that over the years have felt that pharmaceutical waste fell into the medical waste industry. Not the case. It's a pure RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act regulated item, unless it's a non-hazardous pharmaceutical, which sort of kicks it out into its own category. So this is where it all began, and this is really where we got cradle to grave. The waste generation through ultimate end disposal and forever status. For those of you who are familiar with HSWA, the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments from 1984, I wanted to cover it a little bit because it sort of continued where RCRA Subtitle C left off. Additional regs, and it was enacted largely due to the public's opposition at the time to the current hazardous waste disposal practices. So really the first time we got to see the public being involved as it related to waste disposal on the hazardous waste front. Why I wanted to mention it here is because in addition to adding restrictions on land disposal regs and LDRs, if you're familiar with those from the EPA side of the house, and underground storage tanks, it really speaks to regulating SQGs, small quantity generators. And we all know that the majority of pharmaceutical issues are really derived from being an SQG. It's not super easy to comply with the existing rules and regs that are brought up by pharmaceutical waste management. So we'll go through some of those, but wanted to cover HSWA relatively quickly. And of course, in all of these regs, they currently live within the Code of Federal Regulations under 40 CFR from the EPA. Title 40 refers actually to the protection of the environment, and we'll relate to this later where the new regulations actually will live within the Code of Federal Regulations. So I wanted to cover that and make sure that everybody was on the same page about where these items lived in the regulatory world if you weren't familiar with it. So who's covered and under what parts currently? Here it is. Generators really are businesses, institutions, government, local, state, federal governments, or installations that produce hazardous waste, RCRA hazardous waste, ignitable, toxic, reactive, so on and so forth. Transporters must carry a waste transporter permit for each state where they'll pick up waste or drop waste off. These permits are issued by the state environmental authority. I'm sitting in Massachusetts right now. It's the Department of Environmental Protection. But every state sort of has their own iteration of this, and New York, it's the DEC, Environmental Conservation. It's different in a lot of states. Transporters must also carry a valid EPA ID number, and generators really can be held liable from choosing a transporter who doesn't carry those credentials. So be careful with the folks that you choose to transport your hazardous waste because they're regulated too. And then TSDFs. Treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. These carry a state-issued permit to receive haz waste from the generators, and in a lot of cases are permitted to store the waste for up to a year. They could treat it immediately or dispose of it immediately. But depending on the conditions of their permit, that's where those will play a role. And generators are ensuring that their waste is shipped to a properly permitted TSDF. It's part of the cradle-to-grave requirements. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, Part 261 through 271 covers where those are regulated in the Code of Federal Regulations if you really wanted to take a peek. Currently, there are many types of waste under RCRA. If you think of RCRA, you typically have something that you've already decided to throw away. So you have to become a solid waste prior to being determined whether or not you're RCRA. Currently, those regs fall under a couple of categories. Delisted, characteristic of something, think ignitable material. If I don't have any ignitable material in a container, it's not ignitable. It doesn't have that characteristic. Same thing for corrosivity. Something that's F-listed, it's waste from a non-specific source. Multiple industries, We see a lot of F codes related to spent solvents, whether that's from industry, whether that's from healthcare, whether that's from life science, and higher education. So we see a lot of F codes specific to spent solvents. The K list is very, very specific. For most of us on the group today, we won't have any K lists. We probably haven't seen a K list shipped ever. For those of you, if you're attending from general industry, there are some very specific generation sources that do get K codes, and because you would generate those, you would typically understand what those regs look like. And then when we sort of relate to pharmaceuticals, as we take a step back here, there's U lists and there's P lists, and these are specifically listed items that are specifically, they have to be virgin material, meaning unused, and the sole active ingredient. If they don't meet those two criteria, you don't have a U listed item or a P listed item. So it's really critical to understand that when you're characterizing your formularies, when you're building your lists to collect the items that you're required to collect under RCRA. So again, virgin unused, sole active ingredient, and it has to also be a commercial chemical product, which is part of the rules under RCRA as well. For the most part, we see the D's, the U's, and the P's in the pharmaceutical world. A lot of the ignitable-based items, fall under the D lists. We see other items like, cresol-based insulin for preservatives, mercury-based preservatives. Those are all D codes. The U's and the P's we see a lot with chemotherapy agents and other toxic iterations of some of these medications, cyclophosphamide, melphalan, mitomycin, things like that. And what these ultimately determine, not only how you rate and collect your hazardous waste, your hazardous pharmaceutical waste, it helps determine your generator status. And federally, we all get placed into one of these three groupings, and in some states, they actually have additional qualification categories. Massachusetts is a great example. Instead of CESQGs, Massachusetts has a specific standard for VSQGs, very small quantity generators. Baltimore, Maryland, the Maryland area is full quantity generator instead of large. And some have different iterations of small quantity generators. So they help to further define a generator's involvement in RCRA and really what kind of regs that you're governed under. And the state will always take precedence because the regs will be more stringent if they've been able to modify the federal law. So most states, a lot of states follow the Fed, where some have chosen to be a little bit more stringent. And last, as a component of our RCRA overview, here are some major aspects of what we believe to be any pharma program. Really as they're regulated under RCRA, like the fact-finding mission is really the beginning process of this, and it's formulary characterization. It's performing a waste determination. Anything and everything that a regulated industry has to throw away, they're required to perform a waste determination on that material. Here we also include reverse distribution for those of you in pharmacy on the group. A lot of the companies that are either crediting or receiving back material and not giving credit have a little bit of a wake-up call under this new law. We'll go through it step by step. We even have an extra section on reverse distribution, and so on. These parts really help to address questions like, what do I have? Where is it? Where does it go internally? How do I need to collect it? What do I need to collect? And ultimately, who do I need to educate? So before you begin any program, whether it's a brand new program from scratch or updating, address the fact-finding components. Take a peek at your formulary again if it's been a little while. Review about a year's worth of reverse distribution documentation. Do my satellite accumulation areas exist in the correct places? Could they be better managed? What do my waste streams look like? And what do my containers that I'm using look like? And then so on. And then obviously we want to make sure that the education is a component that does a program well. There are some reduced training and education requirements that we'll walk through as part of this new promulgated law. Most importantly, I think that all of Triumvirate's built programs, for anyone on the list today that's listening that has a Triumvirate built program, they were built in a way that make this transition pretty easy. So a lot of it's labeling and signage related to the way that the new law takes place. Should be a relatively easy transition. So that was our RCRA overview. Now let's go into what most of you and most of the industry in healthcare really discuss the current issues. There's 6 of them, and the way that this is going to work is I'll identify the 6 issues. We'll walk through them slide by slide, and then as we talk about the proposed rule and the overview of the proposed rule, I'll give everybody a few minutes to think about them as we then sort of go right into any of the components that are success stories for the current issues. So there's 6 of them that are major related to this new promulgated law. So let's jump into it, and we can address those proposed solutions as we walk through. Issue number 1, large quantity generator statuses for greater than 1 kilogram of P-listed waste. So we all know P-listed waste has been a problem for small quantity generators, right? Anytime you generate more than 2.2 pounds of that material, you're already a large quantity generator. One other thing that I really want to mention here is I use that word very specifically, generated. It's waste generated. It's not waste shipped. Now, the regulators have one mechanism to review what you've generated, and that's the manifest, and obviously what waste is shipped. But keep in mind, in an inspection, you have an opportunity, and that opportunity is to share with them when that waste is generated and ultimately when that waste was created over time. So if you don't pull waste every month, it's a little bit easier to shed a light onto the waste generation process and ultimately the weight that you have generated of P-listed waste specifically. So absolutely burdensome for small and conditionally exempt small quantity generators. It really covers these shorter accumulation times, and it triggers biennial reporting requirements if you've got to become a large quantity generator. What few people realize is, regardless of whether or not you've actually registered as a large quantity generator, you are a large quantity generator from the moment you generate more than 2.2 pounds of P-listed waste, or 1 kilogram per calendar month. And hazardous waste in general, for your entire industry, not necessarily specific to pharmaceuticals, falls in that 2,200 range. So any of that is going to make you a large quantity generator. And this is really issue number 1, because a lot of the pharmaceuticals that we'll see increase your hazardous waste output and increase that closer total to 2,200 a month. And a lot of these, there's not many of them, but there are a few that you generate quite a bit of that quite often trigger 2.2 pounds per calendar month. So the issue was also very specific to increased training and documentation. Getting people RCRA, nurses, pharmacists, services, technicians, folks that are a part of your program, it was a pretty good burden on healthcare, and getting the training right was very difficult, unless you were training everybody, which we've been very successful at, but it's just a lot of people to get to, many different ways to get to them. Issue number 2, residual P-listed containers. This speaks to that law that covered if you had P-listed waste in a container, that container is not empty until it's either been triple rinsed with a solvent, cleaned and purged of all gases and vapors, or it's collected. So no one in healthcare was ever going to triple rinse any of these little vials, these little 1 milligram vials, 1 milliliter vials. We're talking about warfarin and physostigmine and physostigmine salicylate. These items, nicotine, very difficult to triple rinse, and the way the regs were set up make it virtually impossible, and really applies down to the smallest of containers. It could be less than a milliliter. Some states, believe it or not, have not adopted the federal exception for those blister packets, those pesky little warfarin blister packets. Many states have adopted the federal exemption that remove them from the P listing. Some of them don't. And then there are other items like cups. Anybody who's wandered through radiology or some of those areas for imaging, you've got the barium sulfate related drinks that have elevated levels of barium in them because they're in suspension, and ultimately that material collected from a delisted standpoint. So quite a few issues related to P-listed containers and the residual of that. Those are still currently regulated as P-listed waste and required to be collected. Issue number 3, The regs have always been manufacturer-oriented. So manufacturer-oriented regs imposed on healthcare is issue number 3. Many folks still have little to no RCRA knowledge, unfortunately, in healthcare, right? And I'm not talking about all the environmental health and safety professionals listening, and to some extent, facilities management and environmental services. Those typical groups have had a lot of this over the years. We're really talking about nursing and some of the ancillary groups that play a role in moving, medicine and pharmaceuticals around the industry, and also folks that are collecting it because they've used it. Formularies vary over time, so you always got to update these things. It's not 1976 in the middle of the Ford motor plant. These are thousands of little pills and Bristol-Jets and packets and all sorts of different types of drugs, thousands that were all based on manufacturer-oriented regs. So as you'll see as we move forward, they've corrected this and they've updated it quite a bit. So it's not 55-gallon drums any longer. It's very, very small, tiny little waste streams. Issue number 4. This is very interesting. The pharmaceutical waste drain disposal has become a commonly used mechanism for disposal by healthcare facilities. So believe it or not, when you end up in a place where you are not covered under RCRA, where you once had something that was RCRA and now you don't because it's virtually empty or it has the drips and drabs running down the tubing and the piping and things like that, that material was discharged to the waterways and ultimately drinking water. So based on one of the studies performed, drain disposal actually accounts for about 20% of RCRA pharmaceutical disposal. Now, some of it's illegal, some of it's slips through the loopholes and the cracks as non-RCRA containers, things like that. But 20%, that's a lot. When you think of a lot of other pharmaceuticals that end up in red bag or trash, we end up with a very small percentage that actually gets collected under RCRA for hazardous waste disposal. Another varying percentage by location that shows between 25 and 50% end up in the red bag waste stream. A lot of folks have done studies on this, and traditionally med waste is about 90% not med waste. It's plastic and debris and things like that. So we see that process change quite a bit with this variation. So we're asking folks to correct moving those streams, diverting those streams to the more appropriate waste stream being hazardous or non-hazardous pharmaceutical waste disposal. Triumvirate's red to green process with our medical waste recycling process also plays an important role here because we want to make sure that material is collected appropriately. The issue, really, the local POTWs, the publicly owned treatment works, they can't treat this material on site. They don't have the chemical treatment capability, and the quantities are virtually undetectable on an individual basis, so they don't know what they're treating for at any given time. It's a very difficult issue and has been for quite a period of time, as a lot of narcotics are sewered, and a lot of other non-hazardous pharmaceuticals make it down the drain as well. Issue number 5, the intersection of EPA and DEA. This one's pretty self-explanatory and pretty straightforward. The EPA and the DEA have butted heads on some of this for a long time. There's a few RCRA regs, regulated pharmaceuticals, that are also regulated under the DEA. Here are a few of them here in some different scenarios. Chlorohydrate, a lot of folks have decided no longer to use. We'll talk about what the solution looks like, but here are really a few of the intersection items. Most of us have had a nearly impossible experience deciphering between EPA and DEA and where they meet in relationship to pharma. Most of us are familiar with the wasting process, the double sign-off process where this material gets drain disposed. In a lot of cases, our case-by-case approval with a local branch to do anything else other than waste that material down the drain. So big issue here, number 5, and a relatively good solution for it. Number 6, and the last issue that we'll hit on before we start talking about the promulgated, or the to-be promulgated rule, is the regulatory status of creditable pharma. This speaks to reverse distribution, and there are several big players out there, EXP, guaranteed returns, a lot of smaller pharmaceutical crediting companies, Triumvirate has always thought of this as an important component in managing pharma waste, and it's really the last major hurdle. All of our programs incorporate a reverse distribution review, as should any program, reviewing about a year's worth of documentation that actually shows what you've gotten credit for in the past, what you have not gotten credit for in the past. Because if you think about it, it can't be a hazardous waste until it was a solid waste. And if you're getting credit for something, it never falls into the solid waste category, meaning it never falls under RCRA. So very specific as it relates towards what is waste and what isn't, and more easily defined when you've completed an internal review of what your credit process actually looks like with your reverse distributor. This is a real big issue. The EPA has come down on some of these reverse distributors over the years, and the regs have definitely shifted. So you'll see as we go through some of the solutions to these issues that they've updated into this potential law, and it'll be quite difficult on pharmaceutical reverse distributors. Now, the cradle-to-grave piece here, relating to this material, there has never been a manifest process. There's no paper trail. So if something has to get disposed of once it's left the hospital, you end up not having a cradle-to-grave process. So we'll talk about a solution for this at length in a few minutes. Back to our agenda slide. Let's get in touch with the details of proposed rule. Under the overview of the proposed rule, we'll be looking at these items. Think of this as a sort of a sub-agenda slide, some of the definitions of what a pharmaceutical is under this rule, which are actually covered, who and where do the regs live, and who's covered and affected, what the Fed says about the states and state adoptions, and then we'll go into the 6 major solutions. So let's start by defining some terms here. The definition that they've built as it relates to pharmaceutical definitions for this particular law, and I'm going to read this. I don't typically read slides, but I'd like to, from this perspective, that any chemical or biological product that is intended for use in the diagnosis, the cure, mitigation, care, treatment, or prevention of disease or injury of a human or animal, or chemical or biological product that is intended to affect the structure and function of the body of another human or animal. It's a pretty specific but wide-casting definition. It's changed a little bit over the years. It's broadened, but it ultimately gets where a lot of things can be considered pharmaceuticals. So it includes, a lot of these dietary supplements, scripts, over-the-counter drugs, personal protective equipment that's contaminated with pharma, clean up spilled debris. It really goes further to reflect more of what the FDA calls a pharmaceutical than traditionally what we've known under RCRA. And if you're not familiar, one of the key ways to identify some of these are an NDC number, a National Drug Code number. Make, model, and color for a specific drug, specific dose, specific manufacturer. And that's a lot of how we characterize pharmaceuticals in the industry to determine whether it's hazardous or not. So specific here, and here you can see sort of what is included but not limited to, really. More on pharmaceutical definitions. There's a little bit more inclusions, and it's broader than the former UPW, the Universal Pharmaceutical Waste Rule, that states like Florida and Michigan had adopted, and this sort of had taken a modeling after. But it includes all the dose forms of tablets, capsules, gums, all those things here. And it really follows the FDA, as mentioned before, in the definition of what a drug is. And just generally, if the FDA requires a drug label fact sheet, then it's considered a pharmaceutical. It does not any longer include waste sharps. Some of you may have remembered the sort of sharps exemption, I guess we could call it, meaning had a sharps dose of something been spent for its intended purpose, regardless of sort of what the residual material was in it. That had no longer been regulated and was intended for the sharps containers. So it does not include waste sharps as part of the pharmaceutical definition. So which pharma is covered? Really like to put some emphasis on this slide and the next because they make some really important points. Only pharmaceuticals that are already considered hazardous waste. They're the only ones that are regulated. They did not increase the list. They did not add pharmaceuticals to it. Only RCRA-regulated pharmaceuticals that are already considered hazardous waste are covered under this new rule. The proposed rule does not propose to include, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that. The EPA has been saying all along they are really trying to encourage healthcare to manage all their pharmaceutical waste under this new rule. There's been some stopping points that have caused that to be issues in the past, but we'll talk when we get to the solutions to those 6 issues why they've been lifted, so to speak, under this new rule. So really important. Only RCRA-regulated pharmaceuticals. Who is covered? This is pretty specific as well. It's healthcare and healthcare only. You have to be covered under a specific code here, and we'll go through those in a minute. For you to be able to take advantage of these rules, there are many scenarios where someone cannot take scenario of this rule. So really like to spend a minute on who's covered. And it's based on the proposed definition of a healthcare facility. So I'll read this as well because it's very specific. A person that provides preventative, diagnostic, therapeutic, rehabilitative, maintenance, or palliative care, counseling, service assessment, or procedures with respect to physical and mental conditions, functional status, or human or animals, or affects the structure or function of the human or animal body. Or someone who sells or dispenses over-the-counter or prescription pharmaceuticals. Pretty detailed, but at the same time, it's not rocket science. It's ultimately very specific, and most of healthcare will fall here. But this is what's important. NAICS codes. Everybody is familiar with these, right? They're the industry sectors standing for the North American Industry Classification System. It gives broader coverage than SIC codes, the Standard Industrial Classifications. And really, it's a digit thing, right? So the SIC codes, were 4. The NAICS codes are 6. But here we go. We got pharmacies, vet clinics, physicians' offices, dentists, 622 hospitals, ambulatory health, nursing care. Specific, very specific. So if you are not one of these NAICS codes, it doesn't include you. You would still be required to follow traditional RCRA. Just a quick bullet point, doesn't include drug manufacturers in this process. No drug manufacturers. In addition to the typical waste generators, reverse distributors also play a part and are now regulated under this new proposed rule. Really, any person that receives and accumulates potentially credible hazardous waste pharmaceuticals for the purpose of credit, right, giving the institution back credit, falls under the definition of a reverse distributor pharmaceutical. So we're talking about the EXPs, the guaranteed returns. There's quite a bit of them, and I have not come across not work with a reverse distributor. Just last for this slide, but I really think it's important to note that there are some drug manufacturers out there that also operate as a reverse distributor. So if we go back to that previous slide that I've mentioned does not include drug manufacturers, it's specific to drug manufacturers that are not also reverse distributors. We talked about where traditional RCRA lives at 40 CFR. This is where the new regulations live. So within 40 CFR, the new proposed regs now live in Part 266 with a new addition to that section entitled Subpart P. And they call it the Management Standards for Hazardous Waste Pharmaceuticals. Interesting enough, Part 266 also covers recycling for the EPA. So very similar section and where it lives with the EPA Code of Federal Regulations here in 40 CFR. but its own specific section. So if you fall under one of those NAICS codes and you are managing pharmaceutical waste, this is where your regs will live. We talked a minute ago about state adoption and sort of where the states fell on this. This is really important. Just a few points here. The EPA is pushing this as more stringent than the existing RCRA reg, so it's not voluntary at all. States will not be picking and choosing whether or not to adopt this. All states will absolutely be required to adopt this final rule if it becomes law. And then all regulated parties will be required to use this final rule. When the sewer ban, we talked about one of those issues being the sewering of pharmaceuticals under HSWA. When it's effective, it'll be effective in all states on the effective date, even before the state's required to adopt the federal requirements for sewering or no longer sewering pharmaceuticals. And then related to UPW, for you folks that might be joining us from Florida and possibly Michigan, anybody that manages their pharmaceutical program under the Universal Pharmaceutical Waste Program, you'll actually have to replace your UPW programs or modify them to comply with this updated rule. So that is an overview of the rule. You know, we talked a little bit about the who and the what and the why and the definitions and things like that. Now let's get into, based on those 6 issues, those 6 current issues that we talked about earlier in the presentation, let's talk specifically to the 6 major solutions, 6 major components, and we'll get through those as they relate. So the first one, the proposed solution to originally issue number 1, and issue number 1, if you remember it, we go back to my notes here. Issue number 1 was the large quantity generator status for anything P-listed waste, right? Anything 2.2 pounds or 1 kilogram generated in a calendar month. So the proposed solution here is hazardous waste pharma, RCRA pharma, do not any longer count towards your generator status. Doesn't matter how much weight you ship, 1 million pounds, 10 pounds, 2 pounds, does not play a role any longer as it did before with that 2.2 pounds per calendar month. Doesn't mean you don't have to collect them. You still have to collect the same items under RCRA. It just, the P-listed waste delineations go away. The D-listed and the U-listed waste items, they go away as it relates to counting their pounds towards your generator status. What this will do is really, it gets people to collect haz and non-haz together if they wanted to, if they opted to collect non-hazardous waste. So it allows the commingling of that. It allows the commingling of P-listed and non-P-listed. If you remember before, very difficult to separate that 2.2 pounds of P-listed waste if you were trying to collect them in one container, being a small quantity generator. So, you know, the vast majority of the population had to collect them in another container, which meant more training, more containers, you know, more inspections, more pickups. But very specific here, and one of the best things about this is it really removes the disincentive to manage your haz and non-haz separately, because it would have traditionally increased your hazardous waste volume if you were putting all of your non-haz in there. Again, no longer counts towards your institution's generator status. You know, other things real quick here. Before you used to have to collect P-listed waste in a container less than a quart. You know, kind of a pesky rule, but if you were collecting P-listed waste in something larger than a quart, it was technically supposed to be regulated as a Maine accumulationer, and a lot of regulatory agencies, state regulatory agencies, have turned the other way because, you know, a quart container is very difficult to manage, you know, for folks. Some people put them on their med carts and things like that, but that process will be done away with. Solution number 2 really goes back to issue number 2, which was the residual P-listed waste in the containers. The proposed solution now allows residues to be addressed via these exemptions. So unit dose containers no longer apply that way. They're exempt. Dispensing bottles and vials up to those limitations there, a liter or 1,000 pills, are exempt. And if all the contents are removed, they are now considered RCRA empty. And to refresh everybody, RCRA empty is a couple of bullet points here. It's 1 inch or less of the material in that particular container. It's 3% by weight for those containers that are less than 119 gallons, 119 gallons being the definition of a bulk container, and 0.3% by weight for containers over 119 gallons. So 1 inch or less, 3% for less than 119, 0.3% by weight for those greater than 119. So there's no more issues related to having to collect containers that once held P-listed material. None of those blister packets, those patch wrappers, even though it was never an option, none of the triple rinsing process ever again. And again here, dispensed syringes, exempt. Again, have to be the NAICS code. You have to be a hazardous pharmaceutical. Healthcare does not apply to your solvents, your laboratory chemicals, your pathology waste, your cytology waste, microhematology, facilities. Doesn't apply to any of that stuff. Just pharmaceuticals once regulated under RCRA and by your generator status. So solution number 2, another great one. Solution number 3, a little bit more of a housekeeping solution here, but relating to issue number 3, where the manufacturer-oriented regs had really been imposed on healthcare. Sorry about that. There's the slide. And under the new law, the solution is a sector-specific standard, and it addresses how pharmaceuticals never played a role in the creation of RCRA back in the mid-70s. So no more small quantity and large quantity requirements here if you're following Subpart P. You do have to make a one-time notification, very similar to an EPID number. It's a form you fill out, and then education is no longer the same as it was under RCRA. It's performance-based. So you build your program, you train your people to your program, right? You could do it any way you want, whether it's online, whether it's, it could be web-based, it could be face-to-face, it could be, 100 different things. You'll be, burdened with proof that it works correctly, but it's all performance-based training. So this is a great solution here for the nursing staff. Some of the larger institutions that we've created programs for, thousands and thousands and thousands of people involved. You got to capture those folks, and now you still have to train them to the ability of the program, but it's all performance-based. And pharmaceuticals are sort of pulled out for biennial reporting, and this being very applicable because they're due in a couple of weeks. And again, just as an aside, biennial reporting is submitting in the even year for the odd year. So the even year being 2016, the odd year, the last 12 months, all of 2015, that's for biennial reporting. So a good solution here to the original 3rd issue. Solution number 4, it relates back to drain disposal being a commonly used mechanism. Remember that up to 20% of pharma is drain disposed currently for disposal. But the proposed solution here is the new rule bans sewering hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. It applies to everybody in healthcare, all those NAICS codes. It applies to all reverse distributors, and it even applies to conditionally exempt small quantity generators. So for you folks who have not been collecting your pharma as a small quantity generator, we're talking about off-site locations, nursing homes, long-term care facilities, you name it. This ban applies to CESQGs, or C-squeegees as we call them in the industry. A really interesting point, did anybody listen to the EPA webinar on this same topic back in October? If you did, they mentioned, and this is interesting here, that the DEA, and this is verbatim from their presentation, DEA no longer allows sewering as a means of destroying controlled substances. We got really interested in sort of those comments because that could be a very significant change for healthcare. But we reviewed this and we found contradicting language from a guidance document in the Federal Register, recent, and a guidance document online. So the Federal Register stating that the DEA does not believe that sewering would render a pharmaceutical controlled substance non-retrievable. As we all know, the narcotics in our waste stream are typically wasted down the drain. So that was from the Federal Register, and the guidance document online states that existing mechanism for disposal were still okay. So we've been trying to get clarification on this specific point, and we've heard things both ways, but stay tuned for this, because this could change things quite a bit for folks that still maintain a sewering process for their double sign-off procedure and that material that ends up down the drain related to narcotics. So this would be a part of the ban, and ultimately would come down to DEA's jurisdiction, who have not been super duper clear. So solution number 4 to issue number 4 with the drain disposal. And as we move on to issue number 5, or solution number 5, it relates back to issue number 5, which was the intersection of where EPA and DEA sort of butted heads, right? So the proposed solution is hazardous waste pharma that is also regulated by the DEA would be exempt under RCRA. Must be managed in accordance with DEA regs, and you just don't have to worry about it under RCRA. It's going to be DEA only. So pretty self-explanatory, nice and simple. Solution number 6 relates back to issue number 6. This is the final major solution to the reverse distribution issue. The point of generation for pharmaceuticals sent to a reverse distributor will now be the healthcare facility and not the RD, not the reverse distributor. So we've got to make sure that we're collecting things and sending things back for reverse distribution that are actually creditable, and the reverse distributor is going to be very specific about what they return back. And this is sort of always, or at least since 2007, been enforced this way with a lot of confusion, right? Because if it was credited, it never became a part of the waste system. It was never regulated under RCRA. If it was not credited, some folks didn't know whether or not they were going to get credit for it before they sent it back. So they put the burden of proof on the reverse distribution groups to help qualify this. So there's a notification component here. Through notification, the reverse distributors have better oversight, really, of what they receive. It's very similar to a manifest/LDR as they exist for generators. So a lot on the reverse distribution, so we're going to jump into that as we get towards finishing up this presentation. Because reverse distribution has always been a component of all of our programs, there are very minimal changes related to this proposed rule if you get one of Triumvirate's programs. It's pretty simple. We review that material, every 6 months, every year, depending on the frequency in which you send material back, and we help you keep your creditable items going for credit, and then ultimately the items that are not being credited back. But namely, labeling and signage changes, and that's really, the majority of it for those programs. Moving forward, we wanted to spend a few minutes wrapping up on the reverse distribution part, related to the new proposed rule. So reverse distributors are now considered a new type of management facility, like a TSDF. They have very similar rules. They're very closely related to large quantity generators. They have a notification process, they have an inventory process, and they have to have security requirements. They're not required to have a RCRA storage permit, like a lot of TSDs, all TSDs are required to have. But they're regulated the same as how RCRA traditionally is regulated right now. There's a proposed definition of potentially creditable. If you remember, the term used to be reasonably creditable. So the EPA, best definition I ever heard was, hey, if you send something back 8 or 9 times out of 10 and they got credit for it, continue to send it because you're going to get credit for it in the future. If it was on the other end of the spectrum, make sure that you're evaluating what that looks like. So a hazardous waste pharmaceutical that's been potentially ready to receive a manufacturer's credit has to be unused, it has to be unadministered, it has to be unexpired. These are things that weren't always the case, or currently aren't always the case. So they have to be at a maximum less than 1 year past its expiration, where that doesn't necessarily fly today. And the definition does not include evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and we'll talk about what evaluated means in a second. It doesn't comply with residues, the remaining residues, because we all know as part of one of the other solutions that residues aren't RCRA any longer. Doesn't apply to PPE and clean up debris for reverse distribution. They will have to follow more traditional large quantity regulations related under traditional RCRA. So here's pretty interesting. What's not creditable. So this is the flip side. This is a scenario where there's no reasonable expectation for a credit. So samples, we all know a lot of folks have shied away from receiving samples over the last couple of years. Doesn't apply to generics when you're trying to return those generic drugs. We talked about the 1 year past expiration. If it's been removed from its original container and repackaged, it's not creditable. So for everybody that buys in bulk and repackages those items, and they all, they not always were, but they're not covered here either. If it's generated from a patient care standpoint and refused by a patient, it's not a creditable item. A lot of this is going to be regulated much more highly by the reverse distributor. This is partly why they put this law as a more stringent process which allowed the states to really have no say, so that you'd be required to adopt these regs. Remember that word evaluated? Here it is. They must be evaluated by the reverse distributor within 21 days. So you send it back to them, rep takes it off site, they catalog it, they bring it back. 21 days later, they got to make a determination. It's either going to get credited or it's moving on to another reverse distributor. You can only have 2 reverse distributors for further evaluation here. That's the max. Or they're the generator at that point. It's got to move to a permitted hazardous waste TSD. If they accidentally receive it as non-creditable, they have a report to fill out. It's very similar to a manifest, and they become the shipper. They got to manage the waste appropriately, and they're allowed 90 days. Again, very similar to an LQG under the existing setup prior to this rule coming into play. And they also have rules related to satellite and central accumulation. They'll all apply with inspections and the whole 9 yards. So the reverse distributors here are really taking a lot of the brunt. Well, we've covered a lot. We spent some time doing an overview. We talked about the issues. We talked about the solutions and the rule and the overview. Here's a little bit of an action plan as we begin to wrap up. So many folks are really wondering, what do we do now? So the administrator, the EPA administrator, has already signed the proposal back in 2015, the end of August. It was published in September in that Federal Register, ADFR 58014. There then was a comment period that they had actually extended, so it was originally supposed to be over in November before the holiday, and they added another 30 days right till about Christmas. So it was a 60-day comment period. Obviously that's over. There's been many requests for extension. That was the extension. They are technically still in the review of public comment period, and they're going to proceed in one of two ways. They're either going to finalize the law as is, or they're going to modify it based on some specifics or suggestions. And my contacts at the EPA have been very positive that this is something that's going to be done this year, and it's going to be something that's done probably within the next several months, because everybody was very comfortable and very happy with the proposed changes. So we're a little bit of a holding pattern. If you're a Triumvirate client, feel free to reach out to your rep. If you're either a client or a prospect of ours, please reach out to me if you have any questions. Happy to help out in any way possible, whether it's an existing program that you've got and you have to modify, or a program from scratch. We've covered a lot. I'm sure everybody's got some questions. If anybody wants to make a comment, you can still make a comment, believe it or not, even though the comment period has ended. There's an EPA docket number, so you go to regulations.gov and you search docket number. I'm going to give you guys this docket number. We can follow up with anybody that has any questions, but it's EPA-RCRA-2007-0932. EPA HQ RCRA 2007-0932. This info will be available in our follow-up. and we'll also include sort of a survey and a link to the presentation. But before I turn it back over to James for some questions and some Q&A, I wanted to say thank you for participating. We'll have a couple slides with some additional information following the Q&A session, so if you're interested in that, please hang on. With that, I will turn it back over to you, James. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Steve. Lots of great information there. I know we've got some questions in the queue. As Steve said, reach out if something comes to mind after the presentation, but we'll do our best to get to those that are in the queue right now. We've got a few minutes left, so Steve, let's jump right in. Question from Don: would food supplements fall into this? For example, protein drinks?
No, not unless they have a RCRA regulated level of material in them. So the things I can think of, oh geez, don't quote me on this, but every once in a while someone will test like Ensure, and there are some levels of some of those metals, you think of the RCRA 8, arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, lead, mercury, selenium, and silver. You see selenium hit high every once in a while based on specific types, but it's rare. So traditionally, no. If it did contain an item that could be construed under RCRA, give us a call. Sometimes it's manufacturer specific, and sometimes you got to make sure that you shake it up to get an accurate sample because a lot of that material is in suspension. So when you let it sit, the metals actually fall out to the bottom, and if you pull a sample from the wrong point, you end up with an inaccurate sample. So actually, sometimes those are flavor specific as well, believe it or not. So get us some info on the exact one. We can follow up for you with a number and ultimately what that looks like.
Great. Next question is, where would nicotine patch wrappers fall under? Nicotine patch wrappers.
Great question. So for those of you who are familiar or not familiar with nicotine patch wrappers, they originally fell under the P075 listing. They were P-listed. They federally sort of had been exempted, related to some of those initial exemptions that we've been talking about. Actually, one of the next slides I'll leave up. Just from this particular question standpoint, was a RCRA online memo back in 2010, related to that sort of exemption. So same thing here. If it's exempt under traditional RCRA, it doesn't apply to the new promulgated law. If it was never exempt, it will apply, if that makes sense.
Gina wants to know, how should a pharmacy handle toxic NIOSH drugs?
It's a great question. First and foremost, there are some drugs out there that are both NIOSH and RCRA. So that's your first step. Is it RCRA? If it is RCRA, you're required to manage it that way and this way under this proposed promulgated rule. If it's not RCRA, the next component there is obviously the NIOSH. Many states do not regulate NIOSH. If you're in New Jersey, by chance, which I'm not sure if you are or you aren't, but if you aren't, the NIOSH rules will, if you are, the rules will apply very specifically because NIOSH is regulated as a state-regulated item. So the states still have the ability, in addition to RCRA, to regulate non-hazardous RCRA pharmaceuticals, and in this case NIOSH. So if you're in a state that requires NIOSH drugs to be collected like Jersey, you'll still be required to do that. If not, it's not a hazardous waste. It's a great idea. A lot of folks have moved in the direction of non-hazardous waste for pharma collection. A lot of folks have over the last 6 to 12 months. You could collect them together with your hazardous waste. It wouldn't affect your generator status. That's sort of what EPA was looking for. But it depends on what state you're in.
Thanks, Steve. And let's take one last question. I know there's a few more here, and we'll follow up on those, but this is one it seems a few people have. Under the new rule, is all sewering banned or only for RCRA has waste pharma?
Great question. The rule only addresses RCRA has waste pharma. All the other non-hazardous material is the same as it's been. Good question. Only RCRA.
Great. Well, thanks for clarifying that, Steve. And It looks like we're just at the top of the hour, so I think we'll start to close out now. I know there's some links here that Steve has and some other resources you can check out. We appreciate everyone's attention, your questions, and for participating
James,
today.
just real quick, let me just run, James, real quick, let me just run through some of these so people can address them. The page that's up right now is if you're familiar with the EPA exemption, residuals for the partially syringes, the nicotine we talked about a few minutes ago. These are all exemptions that had come into place over the years. These would be the things that also would be exempt under the new laws. And then the second page here, I just wanted to address because some of these are a lot newer. Some are in 2015 that some of you may not have seen yet. But e-cigarettes, big one that came out last May, and some of these aren't exemptions. Some of these are just quicker online memos. So take a peek at them if you have any questions. It'll be on the slide deck. And another one that was 2015 was household pharma being collected for DEA. So sorry to interrupt you, James. I'll let you finish up.
No worries. Thanks for going through that. And as Steve mentioned before, we will be emailing you tomorrow with a copy of this presentation, a short link to a survey. Let us know what you thought, and also an offer to help you get started in preparing for this regulation. There's Steve's information if you want to reach out. Again, we'll be following up directly within the next day so that you receive all of these materials. That's all we've got for today. Thank you, Steve, for addressing us on this issue, and thank you, everyone, for participating today, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.